It's a pleasure to be here and an honor, and we're very grateful to have this opportunity to discuss a very important topic that's dear to both our hearts, to both Eda and I, and we both relate to it and have lived with it. Eda's husband is on the panel, David Schottenstein, who is a philanthropist. I grew up with a father, Rabbi Yossel Gutnick, who was a big philanthropist, and it's something that I was always very proud of, and I know Eda is very proud of her husband being a giving person, and it's an honor to be with all of you today, with David, with George Rohr, and with George Lindemann, and we look forward to gaining some insight and how we can all find a way in our own lives to be like you. So
first, he has to change his name to George.
Okay.
I was just going to add, you said Yossel Gutnick was a big philanthropist. He is a big philanthropist.
He is a big philanthropist, that's right. Once a philanthropist, always a philanthropist. And you can't take that away from anyone. When someone has the gift of being wealthy and chooses to give, that's a huge test. And and you guys are in it. And thank you. Thank you, David, for sharing that. So we're going to start with George Rohr. We wanted to ask you if you can share one or two of your early experiences that paved the way and helped shape who you are today.
I assume you're asking the question in the context of what we're calling philanthropy here. Is that, yeah?
Yes, in that context.
So I would say that there were two specific episodes that I can recall from my childhood that were formative in the way that you're asking the question. One was that my parents made it an ironclad rule that whenever we got our allowances, my sister and I, we had to give maser from that allowance. We have to give 10% of whatever we received as allowance. We had to set it aside for tzedakah. And there was no deviating from that rule. And not only that, they were very intentional about then what would happen to that money that we put into the tzedakah box. So the whole idea was that this was an obligation, a consistent ritual almost, and something that was taken for granted as an absolute must. So, you know, if you're 8, 9 years old and you start getting allowance and that happens week in and week out and there's discussion around it and what are you going to do with the money and how are you going to help people with it, for very, very small amounts, it really begins to become a part of you. So, you know, I think that was certainly a very useful formative experience. The second one was the week before my bar mitzvah. My father made it a point of sitting down with me in his study and telling me that he was about to give me a talk that his father had had with him the week before his bar mitzvah and that his grandfather had had with his father the week before his bar mitzvah. And he wanted this to continue and that he hoped that I would do the same thing with my children before their b'nai mitzvah. And that was to say the following. He said, God willing, if you work hard and Hashem blesses you, one day you'll be in a position to help other people and to give tzedakah. You should know that you must continue to give tzedakah, and you have to give maser, and be very, very careful about the calculation of maser, meaning giving at least 10% for the rest of your life. And I'll give you historical support for this. He said this to me. Everybody knows the Rothschild family. Even I, at age 13 in Bogota, Colombia, had heard of the Rothschild family. But there were many wealthy Jewish families around the time of the Rothschilds and in decades after that prospered in Europe. They've all disappeared. Only the Rothschilds are still active today. And the reason is that they were extremely meticulous about maser. Throughout the generations, because the patriarch of the family established that. And we know that not because we have tax returns from the Rothschild family in Germany from inception, but because Meyer Amschel Rothschild, the patriarch of the family, kept very meticulous records, and those records still exist. And they continue to exist and to thrive. and the others will all disappear. You should know, if you don't give maser, if you don't give tzedakah, that's what happens. So you must always be very, very careful about giving that.
Wow, so since you were a kid, it was a non-negotiable. Like, we have to give Meiser. It's not a choice. It's an obligation.
Correct.
So to you, I'll say George L., just to keep it clear. So there are many people out there who are successful business people. There are many people out there who are generous. What would you say distinguishes people who are successful business people from people who are coined philanthropists?
You know, I looked up those words right before our meeting, and generous appears in both, but this was one that I thought was interesting. When he's talking about generous, they said, showing a readiness to do more than is strictly necessary or expected. And it led me to the conclusion that I wasn't generous in these terms, because I don't do more than is necessary. I don't do enough. It's also necessary. So I think it was interesting going down the word search. I think in today's world, certainly the world of the last year, the difference is, are you successful and you're generous with your money? That's lovely, but are you doing much more than are you doing everything you can with your own time and your money? Because so many of the people in this room and on this panel are not only have the ability to write a $100 check, but they're so smart. And our brain power combined with the generosity is what I think is needed at this moment.
It's interesting because we were going to ask, what are the characteristics that philanthropists often have? And it sounds like one of the things you mentioned is this feeling like I need to do more. And that doesn't really line up with the definition of a philanthropist, which is someone who does more than's necessary. So
Probably because a philanthropist always feels like they need to do more.
Right. So I guess the world has to be the judge of whether the person...
We're judging. We say you're very generous. Yes, so David, so I know that you're very motivated and giving is something that drives you. So what is it? What motivates that drive and your passion for giving? What do you think it is within you?
Are you saying what?
Well, some people some people have to create, they really have to work hard to want to give. So I'm wondering, is it something that you work at? And it seems to me that it's something that is really within you, or something that you saw from your parents or your family. What is it that... how did you become to be such a passionate, driven person and very much directed at giving?
So, first of all, I'm half Moroccan, so you're born with that already.
Yeah.
You're already ahead. But it's true, for me, it's two things. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and I grew up in a home and in an environment where people were not judged based on how successful they were in business. It was almost never talked about. It was always about what have they done with the success. So the measuring stick was always based on, well, a guy could be the most successful businessman. In fact, one of the most successful businessmen in Ohio, who is not particularly known for being a philanthropist, no one cared about him. He was a non-entity. The people that were talked about were all the people who made philanthropy. The difference between a philanthropist and a businessman, I think, is purpose, right? A businessman is doing business for the purpose of doing business. A philanthropist is a businessman who's doing business primarily for the purpose of philanthropy. So that was a big differentiator. And when I heard that famous story about, I think it was Moses Montefiore, when he was asked about his net worth, he gave a number that was much smaller than what he was known to be worth. He said, "That's the amount that I gave." So that story, that's my net worth. That's the amount that I gave to charity. So that story always struck a chord with me. The other big, thing that drove me was there was a speech that I heard with Eda at the Ohio State University Chabad House, and Rabbi Yossi Jacobson was the one giving the speech, YY, and he told the story about. It's a long story, but the takeaway message from the story was that when we give, we oftentimes feel like we are the giver, and we are the person receiving is the beneficiary of our gift. But ultimately, as it is explained in Chassidus throughout, and as the Rebbe said many times, the giver is really the receiver. We are really the ones who are benefiting when we give, on every level, spiritually, physically. Today's Tanya portion talks about that very explicitly, how when we give tzedakah, we are literally producing armor for spiritual and all sorts of spiritual and physical things. So I always saw it, and I see it till today, that when I am lucky enough to be able to give to a great organization or to someone in need, who really is in need, I am receiving much more than they are receiving. So that for me is all the drive I need.
That's beautiful. And how do you decide which causes to give to? What's the driving factor?
So it's very difficult because there's so many wonderful causes that you want to give to. You want to give to everybody. And actually, as a kid, I always wondered how you actually handled that, because I know that the Rohr name is on on campuses across the country, and I always wondered, how does he deal with that pressure? Because great organizations come and they ask for a check. What do you do? So
How do you deal with it?
Huh? Yeah,
You can ask him now.
My thing is really, halacha gives a prescription because it's so hard. It says you deal with your city, the people of Israel, and your family, and then everything beyond that, obviously we give to things beyond that, but those are the priorities. After that, you have to be a bit more, I would say, with the city and with the family and with the poor of Israel, it's bli cheshbon, right? I don't make much of a cheshbon, but then outside of that, I have to be a little bit more methodical in what I'm saying yes to and what I'm saying, I'm sorry, we can't. But I would love to hear George.
What about George Rohr?
So, David, you say that you see the Rohr name in all these places. The reason for that is that I want my kids to see where their inheritance went. So let there be no doubt. That's
a good one.
Yeah. By the way, our sages give lots of other very good reasons as to why it's actually accretive to the cause for donors to lend their name as well as their capital, as well as investing their capital in these things. Yeah. So in my case, that's
actually the Rebbe actually told my father to put his name on buildings or on anything that he donates to, that his name should be on there. But there's also something very special about someone donating anonymously. So I guess you have to decide.
No, of course.
Yeah.
But in terms of how do you decide and how do you make the allocations, it's as you said, it's very, very hard, and it's a constant struggle. In my case, by and large, the decision that I've made is that about 20% of my giving is to urgent needy cases, individual needy cases, situations of crisis, situations of families in Israel, the things that are not, let's call them, programmatic. The other 80%, I feel that I have a responsibility to seek as much leverage as I possibly can for its impact. And so it ends up going to causes that have disproportionate constructive impact on the Jewish people that can then have sort of a ripple effect beyond what it does in the immediate time frame. So Chabad on Campus is one. JLI, I'm very proud of being a part of, is another. So that's really the mindset. It's an 80-20, roughly 80-20 calculation.
Oh, it's 80-20. So 80 would be
programmatic giving, and then 20% would be to urgent, immediate, needy causes that need, individual situations, family situations that need the money now.
Did you come up with that idea, 80-20, in that regard?
And it's completely
really nice.
Arbitrary, and I don't know that it's the best, but it's
Bringing
what I'm
light
working
is a
with.
preventative, Phil.
Sorry?
Bringing light, like
Yes.
having an impact, is preventative for those situations.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay, so
On the topic you mentioned about giving anonymously versus the name, I just want to point out from real life experience that when we started giving, your father's story with, I think he asked the Rebbe about whether to put his name, and the Rebbe said, do so because it will inspire others. And I just have to say that in real life experience, the Rohr name inspired us certainly to become bigger givers. So it worked. And I think it yields a tremendous result in terms of for the future generations of philanthropists to see, to be inspired by other philanthropists, by the old guard. Not that you're the old guard, not at all. But that was a huge difference maker for us, no question. That was always my measuring stick. And anonymously, I think whenever you're giving to someone on a personal level, there's no need to have your name on anything. That's where, in fact, it's nice if they don't even know it's coming from you. It's not always easy to do it that way, but certainly I don't see, there's no benefit having your name on that.
Fully agree with that.
And George L., would you like to add something to that?
Well, I didn't know that there was a famous rabbi who said David.
The Lubavitcher Rebbe.
The Lubavitcher
City, family,
Rambam.
Israel.
That's Rambam.
Israel. That's sort of how I do it, but I'm glad to hear it that way.
Your
And
intuition was good.
but I think there. So much to learn. You guys are obviously experts. I think it's a case by case, whether it's your name is up there, it's anonymous, especially today. There's plenty of moments where anonymity gets more done. And in my mind, it just depends on what it is, what the specific case is.
Right, you have to be able to discern, as you go, like which organizations need you right now, which ones maybe a little less so, and that probably changes over time.
What has changed in my own head recently is the notion of Jewish people giving to capital campaigns. Unless it's for obviously a Jewish organization, but for non-Jewish organizations, I don't know that I will give to capital campaigns anymore. And that won't change whether it's 90-10 or 80-20, that won't change the amount I give or how hard I work at trying to make things better. But, I was at a university recently walking around and I'm looking at the names on them and I'm thinking, gee, they probably think I wish we hadn't done this. And so I'm very reluctant to engage with any capital campaigns right now. Would much prefer to give to operating funds or specific programs because the world changes so fast, especially for Jews, and I don't want to be associated with something that turns on me.
Another question relating, yes, that does deserve a round of applause. Another question relating to giving, philanthropists often have a natural inclination to be generous and to want to give and to want to say yes. How do you handle, I would imagine you're inundated with requests from many different amazing organizations who want your help. How do you handle saying no when you're a generous person who probably would like to say yes to everyone coming to you? Well, almost everyone, not everyone.
Really poorly. I don't. It's hard. So I try to do something or avoid people. There's so many good causes, and I'm not good at saying no. I'm dying to hear.
George or Jiminy?
It is very hard, but sometimes you have to say no. I found that there are ways to say no that can make people feel, I won't say good, but at least less bad about the no. If you take the time to sit down with a person or to discuss over the phone or over Zoom why it is that you're saying no and being completely open and transparent about it, putting into context the other demands on your tzedakah budget for them, telling them that the work that they do is something that in your eyes is valuable and noble, and that they themselves are valuable and noble, and you try to uplift them in the course of that conversation. It not only takes the edge off, but I've had situations where people actually thank me and they say it's, that's the nicest no I've ever gotten. And in cases where I've put it into writing, they've saved the letter and they showed it to other people saying, this is how you should say no to me.
I think that's beautiful. This way the person feels like they were heard, and then it's in Hashem's hands, like at least they were heard by you. Right. And then also there's a way to give without actually giving tzedakah, but you're giving because you're giving them the time and allowing them to share their mission or their story.
Hope so.
I want to also ask David this, because I know what I watch you all the time, wanting to give but having to say no a lot. So I wanted you to speak to how you do it, because I actually feel like I need to learn how to say no in other areas, like, when you're a yes person. And I think, my husband, David, just taught me how to do it, still working on it. And I know it's not easy, so why don't you share with us?
So really it's what George said, which is it needs to be a compassionate no, and a no that lets the person on the receiving end of the no understand that it's not coming from any other place other than you have limited resources, and it's not about them. It's not you, it's me, right? It's like, you hear that a lot. So but that's the truth. When you're vulnerable and you tell someone, listen, you have an amazing organization, and I never say no. It's always, I can give something small, a token amount to participate, so I can be part of, I really want to be mishtatef. I want to have some level of partnership with you. I just can't do what you're asking me. And I'll really be, like George said, pretty detailed about why. I have this commitment, I have this commitment, I have this commitment. For me to make another commitment before being able to satisfy what I already have on my plate would just be irresponsible. And that's what it comes down to. And I'm not going to say every time I've said no, the person has been pleased or even nice about it. But I'll say by and large, people are understanding.
I would think a philanthropist says yes most of the time. Is that the case?
From my experience, it's always yes, but with the caveat, it's not yes to what you're asking me. It's yes, I'll give something, but I can't give exactly what you're asking. That's usually what it is. I think it's an uncomfortable position. The worst, I will say, I heard you say, avoiding people. I get it, and I see certain numbers come up, and I also, am very tempted to avoid. But I found in my very short experience as a philanthropist, it's only been since I'm 40, since I'm 20, that avoiding people does not usually yield a great result. And usually you end up saying no after they've tried you 5,000 times, and then it's not a great no. So it's better to just get it out of the way, and as uncomfortable as it is.
A lot of good lessons here. So to George Rohr, how would you say your philanthropy affects your business endeavors? Like, does it take you away from your business? Does it enhance your business? Like, what are the roles? How do they relate to each other?
Short term, my philanthropic work certainly takes away from a focus on business, and it leads to varying and sometimes very high levels of sleep deprivation. So you just have to find more hours in the day in order to balance the demands from both sides.
You don't have more hours in the day.
What's that?
You don't end up having more hours in the day.
But you don't wind up having more hours in the day. You just sleep less, less and less and less. But that's in the immediate term. In the longer term, though, quite the contrary. I have seen direct evidence, but direct, concrete evidence that my giving tzedakah contributes to the success of my business. In fact, it's we know in Jewish law, it's the one thing that we're allowed to test the Almighty about. God says, tithe, give 10%, and I will more than repay you over and over again. And I've seen that in my own life in spades all the time. So it certainly does not detract, other than sleep, but it contributes consistently and fully.
And I think that involves faith, emunah and bitachon. And has that played a big role in your life? And I wanted everybody to share a little bit about that.
Yes, you say the words emuna and bitachon. Emuna means faith, and bitachon means trust. And I heard from Rabbi Shalom Lipsker, who's in the room, many years ago. He had a beautiful insight that he shared with me. What is the difference between emuna and bitachon, between faith and trust? Emunah, every Jew has emunah. You believe, and when it comes to tzedakah, you believe that you have an obligation to give 10%. So you do your calculations at the end of the year. This was your income. 10% is this much, and you give it to tzedakah. Why? Because you have faith in God, and God says you're supposed to do this. Trust, bitachon, is on a whole different level. It's an entirely different thing. What is that? Jew wakes up in the morning and he sees that there's another Jew in need who needs help immediately. He doesn't start making calculations. He doesn't see whether it fits into his budget right now. He knows that God's going to pay him back in spades, and he goes out and he helps that other Jew with whatever he needs. That's bitachon, and that's a whole order of magnitude of greatness in tzedakah than emunah, which in itself is a very high level. I'm happy to say that those of you who want further clarification of this should see Rabbi Lipsker at the end of the session, and he will give you further details.
But that was a good example of bitachon. Right. And George L., do you have anything to share about your faith in regard to giving?
Well, just the question before about business and philanthropy, and for me, I found that they go hand in hand. I don't think one benefits more from the other or vice versa, and especially when combined with activism, not just writing the check, but doing whatever it is that my skill set from my accumulated experiences can bring to the table. That's when I have the most impact. If I could write the $500 million check to rebuild a kibbutz in the South, I would. But I can't, so I have to do what I can do good in my city, which I live here, and I can do the best. I can have the most impact if I combine money and a skill set accumulated through a lifetime of both business and philanthropy.
David, your wife is the Shara Bitachon queen. Yeah.
So the bitachon is not something that I can honestly say I was very strong in. I'm not going to say I'm strong in it now, but certainly stronger than I was a few years ago because of really learning Shara Bitachon with Eda on a daily basis. And it's a muscle that needs to be exercised. Fortunately, and going back to your question about business and tzedakah, that experience has really given me a lot of evidence. I'm lucky enough to actually have real evidence to see that that tzedakah really does contribute to the business success. Aside from the fact that the more tzedakah we've given, I think we've always tried to give ahead of what we're earning. We've always seen that catch up, Baruch Hashem. There's been so many instances and stories in our lives, our personal lives, on the business side where we've seen tzedakah play a huge role. I can share one anecdote just to illustrate
Absolutely.
that. I had a suit company years ago, and this is one of my clients, and there was a point in time when...
1 minute, were you happy with your suit?
This is why I'm so dapper.
So in 2011, there was an opportunity. Eda's parents are the shluchim of the Russian community in Montreal, and for 40 years, they never had their own shul. And they were always renting and going from place to place. And the building became available a few years before. I wrote my in-laws a check, and I said, it's not enough to buy a building, but put it into an account because you're going to buy a building. It was a dream. And a few years later, an opportunity came up to purchase a building that was like the perfect building, the perfect location, and they wanted to build it. I knew it came up, but they didn't have a donor, and we didn't have the cash. So because of that, I went to see an investment banker, and that started the process that led to me selling the company. The first thing I did when we got paid for selling the company was we wired the money to buy the building. The first thing that went out. When I did the deal, I remember being told that you're making a mistake. Within 2 years, the whole business landscape in the custom clothing industry had changed. China flooded the market with, all my salespeople ended up leaving to start their own businesses, and the whole thing really fell apart. That's, but that's just the way it happened right in front of our eyes. If not for that opportunity to buy the building, if not for being motivated by that, I would have been sitting on a business that went from 150 salespeople to 20 salespeople and really no value.
It's nice when you can see the revealed divine providence. George Rohr, can I ask you, I would love for you to give advice for aspiring philanthropists. So what advice would you offer to a young person with this dream of becoming a philanthropist?
Well, the first thing I would say is in these discussions and in that hypothetical discussion, we should get away from the term philanthropist.
The topic today.
Right. No, but the term is, I think we lightly use the term philanthropist, and the world understands what it is, but it's not a Jewish term. If you look at, and we were doing word searches before, if you look at the etymology of the word philanthropy, it's philos, which means love, and philanthropy, anthropos, is of other people, love of the other, right? So the connotation is that you give because you love the other. In Judaism, it's called tzedakah, and the root of that is tzedek, which means justice. We give because it's the right thing to do, because it's just. Not because it makes us feel good, or not because we're nice, or not because we love the other. It's because it's the right thing to do, and the Torah demands that of us. So I would say to this young person, just understand that this isn't something that you do because it's an expression of who you are as a kind and giving person. That's completely irrelevant. You give because you have to give, whether you feel like it or not. And there's a prescribed method of how you're supposed to allocate your giving, and there's an amount. We have an understanding of generosity in this country that is quite different from the Jewish understanding. The Jewish understanding is at least 10% has to be given to tzedakah. Otherwise, you're not fulfilling your obligation. Can you imagine if all wealthy Americans, or all Americans, gave 10% of their income to charity? Can you imagine if 10% of the Jewish world gave its income, of its income gave to tzedakah? We would transform everything. And it's not, I think it's because of a lack of understanding, a lack of literacy about what's expected of us as Jews, that those levels of giving are not where they're supposed to be. So I would say to this young person, we shouldn't talk about philanthropy, and even the word tzedakah is a useful framework, but the real thing to talk about is maser, the 10%. When you set that aside, the rest of it is an allocation decision, right? And so it becomes much easier. You've parted with that 10%. There are many people that all of us know who are wonderful people who feel that when they write a check for the $1,800 that they're giving, it makes them feel wonderful, and they feel like they've really done a wonderful thing. Now it's wonderful that they've done that, but it's far below their capacity and far below of what Judaism expects of them. And it's not because they're bad people. They simply don't know. They simply don't know. It's funny, just an anecdote about this. We live in New York City, and New York has this crazy system of co-ops. Co-op boards in apartment buildings. They're not condominiums, they're co-ops or corporations. So when you buy an apartment, you have to submit a whole package of information, including tax returns from several years and so forth. So my wife was on the board of our building, and so whenever an apartment would turn over, she would receive the applications. And I couldn't help myself sometimes, because I figured I've got to look at these tax returns, because I want to see, you see these letters of recommendation, which also had to be submitted, saying, this couple is so generous to those less fortunate, and they've taken leadership roles in this and leadership roles in that. And then you look at the tax return to the line of the charities, and it's less than 1%. It's 1.5%. But they feel like they are philanthropists. And they're wonderful people and they're nice people, but they just don't know. So coming back to your question, literacy around these issues is very, very important. And that's what I would tell this young person, to really immerse themselves in and take it extremely seriously. And the second thing I would say is that, and George alluded to this, is you have more than just the check to bring to what you do. You have your skill set, your capabilities, your insights, your passions, your drives, your fears, your neuroses. All of those things potentially are accretive to the process of giving that can make the gift even more valuable. And you should not be reticent in adding that to the funds that you contribute.
So you're saying it's an obligation. It's kind of like how you grew up. You saw your parents give 10% to you. It became like a part of your life. And you see being philanthropic as an obligation. But at the same time, do you love it? That's what I want to ask you.
Very much.
Okay, so it's an obligation that you love.
Very
It's
much.
nice to have an obligation that you love.
Right. Very much.
But I like to the point that you made, which I really love about, I feel that saying the word philanthropy means that we're putting certain people in a category, but we're all givers. We all are supposed to give something, and we all can give something. I think if we all feel like Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lezeh, if we all feel responsible for one another, then there will be much more to go around, and we don't have to see this world as sort of us versus them. It's like, oh, us lay people, and then the philanthropists. Let them take care of all the causes that need to be taken care of. No, everybody could do their part. It's not something that I don't want to say the secular world, but the world at large ascribes to, this idea of Meiser. So to George L., what would you say to someone who maybe just doesn't understand this whole concept of giving away anything, let alone 10%, if they came to you and they said, well, what's the point of accumulating so much wealth if your plan is to give it away? Like, just why should I? You know, what's in it for me?
That was an easy question, which I just read before, which is, why wouldn't I? Not why should I? Or I hope I have the guts to do that and do what you said to my kids. Which is, sorry, I had the guts to give every penny I had away. Good luck. Maybe I'll do some part of that, but not all of it. On the philanthropist, when I saw the panel and I saw how my name was listed, I sort of cringed a little bit. I think the word is not, I think it's past. I don't think of myself certainly as a philanthropist, although I engage in philanthropy. I'm thinking that now, especially recently, I'm an activist who backs up what I'm doing, which is just supporting what is just and the right thing. And I support that with my time and my money. And I didn't realize that was the definition of tzedakah. And I'm glad to hear that, because what gets me riled up is seeing the wrong thing. And what encourages me to write more letters and get more people mad at me is that I know that I'm doing the right thing and I'm fighting for justice. And I'm fascinated that those were the exact words. It's neat.
So one of the things I feel you each have to offer is experience in what you've done and what we can learn from you. So I'd love to hear from each of you. Is there a challenge that you had to overcome or a mistake that you made that you learned a big life lesson from that you think we might be able to benefit from hearing about? Let's start with David.
Wow. Is there a mistake that I've made that I've learned from? Yeah, there's definitely a couple. I'll pick one that directly ties into tzedakah. And your previous question, you said, what would we tell a young person to sell them on the idea of philanthropy? So I think, first of all, it's not philanthropy, it's tzedakah. It's an obligation, like you said. It's justice. It's what you're supposed to do, what you have to do. It doesn't even remotely begin to set the scales straight or even in terms of what Hashem has done for you. So don't be a philanthropist, be a Baal tzedakah, right? But then I would, people at the end of the day are can be, especially young people starting off in business, they're very self-interested. So you have to make it good for them, and you have to give them why is it good for you. And the answer is that when you write the $1,800 check, you are not $1,800 poorer, you are $1,800 richer, right? Which sounds great, but practically speaking, how do you get someone young to see that? So in my personal life, I talk about it pretty openly at this point, but I went through a challenge myself, a legal challenge. And there was a point when I had to go in front of a judge. And I've been sharing this with young people, so I'm just gonna, and I can see it's resonating.
Go for it.
Yeah, thank you. So I went in front of a judge, and the judge showed me a lot of rachamim, a lot of rachamim. Rabbi Lipsker was in the room with me there, and we all saw it, and it was very clear that he was being extremely merciful. And later on, after a judge, completes this process, there's something called the statement of reason. And the judge actually files a thing explaining why he did what he did. And for the fine part, he gave me a $0 fine, which was the only time that my lawyers could find in the history of this type of case where there was a $0 fine. There was always a financial penalty. It was the only time there was a $0 fine. And he wrote there, $0 fine. The government had recommended like a $1.2 million fine. He wrote $0. Money would be best left in defendant's possession to continue with demonstrated charitable initiatives. So when we say tzedakah tatzal mimavis, it's not just a nice sounding figure of speech. It's actually real. It what tzedakah saves us from death. Right? It says that. That's where does it say that? I know it says it, but what's the it?
The sages say.
So tzedakah tatzah mimavis.
Is Rabbi Lipsker here?
Rabbi Lipsker, where does it say tzedakah tatzah mimavis? Pirkei Avos? Pirkei Avos. So when it says tzedakah tatzah mimavis, it is literal, it is real, and it is something that I would tell that young person, I never, at 20 when I started giving, never ever saw myself in that position. But I can tell you that when I was in that position, it bailed me out. And that's a mistake that I've learned from, and Baruch Hashem, onwards and upwards, and only going to take that as rocket fuel for the future.
Thank you for sharing. And I remember at the time the judge said it at the time while you were, I was there too, and the judge actually...
You were in the room too, yeah.
He didn't have too much time to think. He just said he recognized your charity.
George?
Acknowledged it.
You ask about mistakes. There's a lot to be said for mistakes. I think looking back, I've made lots and lots of mistakes in the area of what we're calling philanthropy, tzedakah, but I'm not sorry about them, because you have to be able and you have to be willing to take risks, as in business, and you have to be prepared for things not to work out the way you hope. There's always lessons in those quote-unquote failures, but some of the biggest philanthropic risks that I've taken have also been by far the biggest philanthropic successes that I've had. And so when you take a risk that doesn't work out, you tend to think of it as a mistake, but that's just not really true most of the time. There is always something accretive to the learning, to the understanding of how to do things better, differently in the future, and it could have worked out differently. So I don't think people who take their giving seriously should fear making a mistake. The perfect is the enemy of the good, and you should always err on the side of the good. You know, if you can be 80% right 80% of the time, you're still batting .640, which no one has ever done in baseball ever. But that means you've made a lot of mistakes along the way, but you've been a very successful giver.
George.
You know, on the mistake front, again, George, it's super interesting what you're saying. If it's a credible nonprofit, and I gave, and I think of it as a mistake, it's still a beautiful gift to a credible nonprofit. The difference in my mind is my personal impact, which is a word we talked about earlier. What's my goal, and how do I impact the most with the least amount of resources? And so that's how, when I say mistake, that's what I'm referring to right now. The act of giving wasn't a mistake, but for my stated goal today, it was. And you know, I was at a university recently, and I'm walking down the main drag and looking at all of these Jewish families' names on buildings, including mine. And I looked around, and all I thought was, wow, that was a really big mistake. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have encouraged my family to do that. Not because the university is not a good university, but my goal today is to impact Jews, anti-Semitism, and the survival of Israel. And that's my paramount existential goal. And giving, I alluded to this earlier, but giving to a capital campaign, which had what we thought were our goals as a family 9 years ago, is not the goal anymore. And so it was only a mistake. It wasn't, a beautiful arts building is great. Arts are good sometimes. But the mistake was that it was a capital campaign, and forever there was all these Jewish names on these buildings with a bunch of anti-Semites performing in them and exhibiting in them and continuing to spew hatred and using that platform of our gifts to spew hatred. And so the mistake, again, goes back to this capital campaign. It's not the mistake of giving. If we had just given the same amount each year, the moment we realized that it had turned, we could have shifted and said, okay, it's all going to go to Chabad. Sorry, you're not getting any.
Right. Well, that's where
Maybe you had to
mistakes.
go through that, like maybe you had to go through that experience in order for you to come to this conclusion.
Right, like a mistake is a learning opportunity.
Yeah.
In hindsight, you can always understand why that had to happen because it steered you on a new path.
And your intentions were good, so you have to recognize that too. Like you gave, and at the time your intentions were good.
Right.
We always end with a quote, like a favorite quote or parting message, but I just wanted to get this question in. Any of you can answer it, whoever goes first. How would you define success?
Yay.
I'll go first while the smart people are thinking. Achieving success with the assets that you could bring to the table. Achieving some of the goals based on intellectual and financial aspects. We can't solve every problem, but did we move the needle a little bit and make the world a bit more just, in which case it's successful.
Beautiful.
I'm going to say, make my wife happy. Happy wife, happy life. Really it comes down to if my family's proud of me, I'm successful. Because the only way they're proud of me is if I'm doing
Family is proud of you.
Thank you.
So you're successful.
If I'm doing the right things and contributing positively to our family, our extended family, our community, then obviously I know my family, my wife, my children will be proud. And I know that we're building a legacy that we can leave to grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc. That's what success looks like.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what George and David said. I would say certainly if I leave behind a family that's proud of what we've accomplished, that's part of success. I would say, defining the goals and measuring against those goals and the extent to which we've achieved them. And in that context, for me, just more specifically, I think it's important to try and focus on what those goals are and be very intentional and explicit about what those goals are. In my case, it's Jewish literacy writ large. Will we have moved the needle a little bit in increasing that in ways that make sense and that can endure and that can be self-sustainable?
Beautiful, thank you. Okay, so we always end our podcast with a favorite quote. And can you each share a favorite quote of yours? Or if you don't have one, to share a parting message. We'll start with George L.
A woman who was a very generous giver said, and I remember it's 30 years later, I remember she said, "I always tell my kids you have to give till it hurts."
The quote I was going to use was alluded to by David earlier. Sir Moses Montefiore, at that time when he was asked his net worth, and he gave a number that was much lower, which was the amount that he had given to tzedakah. He said at the end of that statement, he said to this interviewer, "You asked me what I was worth. You asked me what I was. I think the quote was, you asked me how much money I have. The answer I gave you is how much money I have. The rest of it can be taken away at any time. It can disappear for any reason, for any time. The money that I've given to tzedakah can never be taken away from me, and that's what I really have." Oh.
Beautiful.
I think from Pirkei Avos, every life is a world, I think is my favorite quote, because I think that if being involved in giving to different things, oftentimes you put this pressure on yourself. What if a lot of people don't show up to this class we sponsored or to this program, right? What if you change the life of one person, you don't know what that one person could go on and do. So
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all
Thank you to each
for
of
coming.
you.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.